On December 6, 1929, a bureaucratic signature in Moscow effectively altered the acoustic frequency of an entire continent. Documented history exposed and then forgotten points to Decree No. 118, a cold administrative directive issued by the Soviet authorities. On the surface, it was a pragmatic decision of a young, industrializing state, a total ban on bell ringing and the immediate seizure of bronze for industrial needs. We are told that the revolution needed tractors, wires, and shells, and that the superstitious bronze of the past was the most logical sacrifice. But when we pull at the threads of this narrative, the official story begins to unravel. The logistics of Decree No. 118 were an engineering nightmare. To dismantle, lower, and transport hundreds of thousands of tons of heavy bronze from the tops of massive steeples required a workforce and a fuel expenditure that often outweighed the scrap value of the metal. Furthermore, bell bronze is not ordinary bronze. It is a high-tin alloy, brittle and specifically formulated for sonority, not for industrial durability. To repurpose it for machinery, it had to be painstakingly resmelted and chemically altered. If the goal was simply raw material, the state could have mined new copper with far less effort. The scale of this industrialization effort was staggering. Over 1 million unique bronze voices were silenced in less than a decade. For centuries, the soundscape of human civilization was not a chaotic noise, but a structured grid of resonance. These bells were not merely musical instruments. They were oscillators tuned to specific frequencies that harmonized with the architecture of the cities they sat within. When Decree No. 118 was enacted, it wasn't just a theft of metal, it was a forced muting of the atmosphere. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. We are led to believe that the world became modern and therefore loud, but the reality is that the world was stripped of its fundamental harmonic resonance. Was the metal truly needed for the factories, or was the industrial narrative a convenient shroud for a systematic operation to reset the acoustic environment of the planet? The sheer urgency and violence with which these bells were destroyed suggests that the authorities weren't hunting for copper, they were hunting for sound. If the bells were the active oscillators, the massive masonry structures of the 18th and 19th centuries were the passive hardware. When we examine the cathedrals, courthouses, and palaces of culture built between 1750 and 1880, we encounter a series of physical anomalies that official architectural history fails to explain. We are told these buildings were designed for aesthetic grandeur or to intimidate with scale. But the physics of these spaces suggests a much more functional, technical purpose. Consider the proportions. Why do buildings designed for 5-foot 8-inch humans consistently feature 40-foot ceilings and massive, arched portals? In thermodynamics and acoustics, these volumes are not waste space. They are chambers designed to manage air pressure and sound wave propagation. Many of these structures contain golosniki, hollow ceramic vessels embedded directly into the upper masonry. Historians claim they were meant to lighten the weight of the vaults, yet they are found precisely at the nodes where standing waves would accumulate. Furthermore, the materials used, red brick, lime mortar, and massive iron tie rods, create a conductive grid. These buildings hum. Even today, in the silence of a preserved 19th century hall, a sensitive microphone can pick up a persistent low-frequency resonance that modern steel and glass boxes cannot replicate. The hardware of the pre-1900 world was built to a specification we no longer use. The doorways are sized not for the body, but for the wavelength. The domes are not just roofs, they are parabolic reflectors. Documented history exposed and then forgotten suggests that we have inherited a planetary-scale technological infrastructure and simply rebranded it as art because we lost the ability to operate it. We look at the massive organs and the complex vaulted ceilings and we see religion, but a radio engineer would see a transmitter and an amplifier. These buildings were tuned. They were part of a global wireless acoustic network that functioned on the principle of sympathetic resonance. We are currently living in the dead shells of this system, using high-tech resonators as mere offices and storage spaces because the signal was cut when the bells were melted down. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The architecture was never about the view, it was about the vibration. A technology is only as functional as the people who know how to maintain it. In the same window that saw the physical destruction of the hardware, we see a systematic deletion of the human software. Between 1840 and 1950, the specialized knowledge required to tune the world didn't just fade away, it was forcibly excised from the record. In Russia alone, there were over 20 major foundry dynasties, such as the Olivianishnikovs, who possessed secret mathematical tables for casting the sound. These were not just craftsmen, they were acoustic scientists who understood the temperament of a city. By 1932, these families had been liquidated as class enemies, their libraries burned and their workshops repurposed. We lost not just the bells, but the tuning forks of our civilization. This purge extended to the architects who understood the physics of the old proportions. Figures like Georg Kochar and Mikhail Mazmanyan, brilliant designers who were part of the late transition, were suddenly arrested and sent to the gulags. Their crime was often listed as architectural formalism, a vague bureaucratic term that masked a much more specific crackdown. They were the last individuals who understood how to calculate the resonant load of a building. When they were removed, the lineage of knowledge that stretched back to the cathedral builders of the 17th century was severed. We see this same pattern in the clerical purges. Between 1917 and 1935, the number of people trained in the specific vocal and rhythmic cycles of the Old World dropped from 200,000 to a few thousand. These weren't just religious figures, they were the operators who activated the buildings through precise harmonic chanting and rhythmic bell striking. When the operators were gone, the buildings became silent. Documented history exposed and then forgotten treats these arrests as political collateral damage, but the result was the total loss of the operating system for the resonance grid. We are left with the hardware, but the technicians have been erased from history. We no longer know how to turn on the buildings we inhabit every day. The official justification for the mass destruction of acoustic technology is always necessity. We are told that the industrial era required a rational approach to materials. But if we analyze this through the lens of pure economics, the story falls apart. The bronze for tractors narrative is a classic archival stitch, a patch designed to cover a hole in the logic of history. If the Soviet Union or the Western powers during their own modernization phases truly needed raw materials, why was there such a specific focus on destroying the tuning instruments? When a bell was seized, the authorities didn't just take the metal. They frequently destroyed the master molds and the tuning charts that were kept in local archives. If you want metal, you take the metal. If you want to ensure that a technology can never be rebuilt, you destroy the documentation and the measurement tools. When the thaw finally came 60 years later and the state attempted to restore the bells, they discovered a shocking reality. They couldn't do it. Despite having modern computers, laser measuring tools, and advanced metallurgy, the first generation of restored bells sounded flat, discordant, and dead. The knowledge of how to create a complex harmonic profile in a single casting had vanished so completely it was as if it never existed. This suggests that the 1929 purge wasn't a resource grab. It was a scorched earth policy against a specific branch of physics. Furthermore, we see a strange redundancy in the destruction. While the USSR was melting bells, the British Empire was modernizing its colonial holdings by replacing resonant stone structures with efficient concrete. The global transition between 1840 and 1950 wasn't an evolution, it was a forced downgrade. We were moved from a world of natural amplification and harmonic resonance to a world of noise and dissonance. The bronze was never the point. The point was to disconnect the human nervous system from the atmospheric frequencies that these bells and buildings once managed. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Industrial Revolution was the noise that was used to drown out the silence of a dying technology. The muting was not a localized event, it was a synchronized global operation. To understand the scale, we must look at the timeline between 1840 and 1950. This is the window of erasure, where the old world was systematically scrubbed to make room for the new. In the United States, we see a parallel anomaly. In 1921, a fire at the Department of Commerce destroyed nearly the entire 1890 federal census. In 1933, the remaining fragments were ordered to be destroyed by Congress. Why does this matter for a story about sound? Because the 1890 census contained the most detailed record of the prairie-set population, including the specific guilds and linguistic backgrounds of the people who built the hardware of America. Just as the Soviet Union was melting its voices, the United States was burning its record. Simultaneously, we see the death of operational languages. In the mid-19th century, dozens of dialects and technical lexicons vanished. These languages contained words for which we no longer have equivalents. Terms like zonost, which describe the singing capacity of an environment, or dukamna, a word used by stonecutters to describe the spirit or resonant frequency of a rock, were replaced by sterile industrial definitions. This synchronization is the stitch in the fabric of history. How is it that at the exact same time, 1921-1933, two ideological rivals were both busy destroying their own pasts? Documented history exposed and then forgotten suggests that there was an institutional coordination to ensure that the new man of the 20th century would have no memory of the resonant world. The disappearance of the 1890 census, the silencing of the bells in 1929, and the linguistic cleansing of the 1930s are all parts of the same pattern. The goal was to create a blank slate. By 1950, the transition was complete. The world was now loud, discordant, and completely disconnected from the harmonic grid of the 1800s. We were told we were progressing, but we were simply being moved into a sensory vacuum. Today, the evidence of this lost acoustic world is hidden in plain sight. It is hidden in the missing archives of the Academy of Architecture, where entire years of research into proportional harmonics are simply gone, replaced by blank placeholders or lost in transit notices. There are keepers of our history who ensure that any mention of the functional, technical nature of these buildings is dismissed as pseudoscience or romantic speculation. But the hardware remains. The cathedrals still stand. The massive iron grids are still embedded in the red brick walls of our oldest cities. If you go to a city like St. Petersburg or London and stand in the right spot at dawn, when the modern noise subsides, you can still feel the hum. The system is not gone, it is merely unplugged. The operators were purged, the software was burned, and the oscillators were melted down to make the very machines that now produce the white noise of our modern lives. But the buildings are still tuned. The frequencies are still there. We have forgotten how to press the buttons, but the machine is still waiting. If someone wanted to erase the memory of how this world truly functioned, wouldn't they start with the sound? If you control the frequency of a society, you control its biology, its focus, and its spirit. Documented history exposed and then forgotten tells us we are the most advanced civilization to ever exist. Yet we stand inside the massive, resonant supercomputers of our ancestors and use them as museums to look at pretty things. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. We are a species with amnesia, living inside a giant, silent musical instrument that we've been told is just a building. The bells are gone, the masters are dead, and the archives are empty. But the question remains, if the grid was so primitive and superstitious, why did they have to work so hard to make us forget it? The silence of the 20th century wasn't an accident. It was the result of a war we don't even remember losing. And until we learn to listen to the hardware again, we will remain trapped in the noise of a history that was written to keep us deaf.